Some secrets don't need locks, they only need timing. That night, wind off the Seine slipped through Paris like a quiet warning, brushing the old stone walls and rattling tall, narrow windows shaped like the eyes of someone who hasn't slept in days. Inside a room lit by nothing but candlelight, Jacques de Molay rested his hand on an aged strip of parchment. It was thin, brittle, and carried that faint metallic scent that old things sometimes have, like time itself left a residue. He didn't look at the writing first. He looked at the seal, a closed circle, inside it a cross with short arms, and at the center, one small dot, like an eye staring back. This wasn't the kind of mark you used for decoration. It was the kind of mark you used so others would remember exactly what they were supposed to remember and never say out loud. In the courtyard below, horses' hooves hit stone. Not rushed, not chaotic, just steady, like a rhythm rehearsed long before tonight. Jacques exhaled and spoke softly, not to anyone in the room, but to the walls themselves. So, it's time. In the corner sat a dark wooden chest, not large, not polished, not impressive at first glance, but the way Jacques glanced toward it like a soldier looking at a flag made the air feel heavier. He took up his pen and wrote a few quick lines, then stopped. The ink pulled into a dark smear. He frowned, as if weighing a single word like it could change history. He didn't write treasure. He didn't write relic. He wrote something stranger. If they ask, tell them we only kept a method. He rolled the parchment carefully. Along the edge he scratched a symbol, something like the letter H, but not Latin, not quite anything the untrained eye could name. A young man stepped in, gray cloak, face tight with tension, like a bowstring pulled too far. "Grand Master," he said, "it's confirmed. The arrest order is signed. This isn't rumor anymore." Jacques nodded, calm in a way that was almost frightening. "The fleet? Ready at La Rochelle. We can leave before dawn." Jacques laid his hand on the rolled parchment the way someone might lay a hand on a living thing. Then let them capture walls and empty halls. What matters goes by sea. The young man hesitated. "But sir, what will the people say?" Jacques looked straight at him, eyes cold and clear, stone under water. People always talk. Power decides what they're allowed to believe. He rose, his white cloak, marked with a red cross, shifted with him. It wasn't just a uniform, it was a reminder. Once you put it on, your life stops belonging to you. Jacques walked to the window. Paris lay submerged in darkness, but torches were beginning to bloom in the streets below, small flames multiplying, like the city itself was waking for something it didn't yet understand. No one in the streets could hear a royal signature scratching across paper. They only ever heard the result. He turned back and opened the chest. Only a crack, just enough to show what was inside. Not piles of gold, not jewels, not the fairy tale fortune people whisper about. Instead, a bundle wrapped tightly in linen, several small slips of paper covered with pale, fading ink, and a thin metal plate engraved with geometry so intricate it looked like music turned into lines. Jacques stared at those objects for a long time, like he was looking at a question no one wanted to answer. Then he closed the chest. It isn't valuable because it's rare. It's valuable because if it falls into the hands of someone who wants to use it to rule the world ends up locked inside a church again. He paused, letting the word church hang there, because he didn't mean stone walls and stained glass, even if that church goes by another name. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. Voices, a command given to an officer, the unmistakable sound of keys. Jacques gave a small laugh, not amused, not bitter, just the sound of someone who's seen the future and knows he can't outrun it. He set the old parchment down and pulled out another sheet, newer paper this time, cleaner, lighter. On it he wrote a single sentence, as if addressing someone who had been dead for years. "Hughes, the oath is still alive." The candle flame shuddered, as though something unseen had just breathed on it. Jacques straightened his back. Then came the knock, heavy, deliberate, on the great doors of the Templar compound. Not a knock asking to enter, a knock demanding. And right then, the real story began. Now, step back with me into the modern view. History records a date, Friday, October 13th, 1307. Under orders of Philip IV of France, the Templars were arrested in a coordinated sweep. A machine of law and accusation moved quickly, so quickly it still feels, even now, like an ambush. But the official version of history often skips the night before. It skips the quiet networks, the warnings passed in murmurs, the gut feeling of men who survived war, politics, and betrayal. Men trained to assume there was always another plan behind the plan. And it skips one of the most persistent legends of all, that a Templar fleet disappeared. We don't have perfect proof, no final manifest stamped and preserved, no royal clerk writing, yes, they escaped by sea, signed and witnessed. But here's what we do have. Logic. The Templars weren't just a group of armed monks. They were, for their time, a sophisticated machine. Military, administrative, financial. They built systems that let a traveler deposit funds in one place and reclaim them in another. They maintained records, routes, contacts, safe houses. They understood logistics the way modern institutions do. So ask yourself, would an organization like that, an organization that dealt with kings, debt, secrets, and war, really have no contingency plan? Would they wait for the door to be kicked in and only then start thinking? Or would they do what Jax did in that candlelit room? Move what matters, leave behind what's expected, and let the world argue over the wrong kind of treasure. Because maybe the real fear wasn't that the Templars had gold. Maybe the fear was that they had a method, a way to store knowledge, a way to move it, a way to protect it from whoever claimed the right to own truth. And if you're wondering why any king, any court, any church would be terrified of that, then we have to go back further. Back before the arrests, back before the trials, back to the man who placed the first stone of the order, when it was small enough to be ignored and dangerous enough to be remembered. Because if Jacques de Molay was the last great symbol of the Templars, then to understand what was really at stake on that night in Paris, we have to return to the beginning.
My name is Hugues de Payens. If you're reading these words, it means I'm no longer living in your world, yet the oath remains. Think of it like a cord tying two eras together. The more you pull it tight, the more it hurts, and the harder it is to break. I was born into a Europe of dark castles, muddy roads, and prayers that were sometimes used like blades. In my time, people argued about heaven more than they tried to live decently on earth. Faith was everywhere, on banners, in courts, in blood, and truth was something guarded, rationed, and sold like a privilege. Then I came to Constantinople. That city looked like nothing I had known. It wasn't just a marketplace for silk and spice, it was a collision of ideas. Greek and Roman thought, Christian doctrine, Islamic scholarship, and older traditions that didn't fit neatly into any sermon. Officially, I went for diplomacy, for alliances, for the fragile politics of a world at war. But the real reason was a question. A question I carried from Champagne, from quiet evenings in chapels where candlelight stretched the shadow of a cross across the stone floor like a trap. If God is truth, why does truth need so many guards? I met them in a small library hidden behind an aging monastery, where the smell of rotting paper mixed with lamp oil. The man who led me there was a scholar named Nikitas. Whether he was real in the strictest sense doesn't matter anymore. What matters is this: he spoke things I had never been allowed to hear. He didn't call them a secret society. He called them keepers of memory. "What are you looking for here, Hugues?" Nikitas asked me. And for once I answered without armor, without rank, without performance. the thing people fear more than an enemy. He studied me the way a judge studies a confession. Then you are looking for knowledge, he said. But knowledge comes in two kinds. One kind makes a person free. The other makes a person want to own everyone else. I asked him, "What do you know about Jerusalem?" Nikitas didn't respond with a sermon. He gave me a map. Not a map of roads and rivers, a map of an idea. Lines of geometry laid over one another, circles crossing circles, like the paths of stars. It looked less like a guide and more like a key. There is a civilization in legend, he said, not to be worshipped like myth, but to remind us of something simple. Human beings once dreamed of a society not ruled by fear. I laughed. I thought he was telling stories the way old men do, stories to pass the night. But Nikitas didn't laugh with me. He placed his hand on a line of ancient Greek text and read slowly as if each word carried weight. Plato called it Atlantis. Of course I knew the name. Anyone with even a little education had heard it. A proud island swallowed by the sea in a single day. A warning dressed as a tale. But Nikitas shook his head. "Don't fall into the trap of the image," he told me. "Atlantis is not only a place, it's a memory of a time when knowledge wasn't locked inside a temple." I leaned in. "And you believe Jerusalem is connected to that?" Nikitas didn't respond right away. Instead, he took out a thin piece of metal, etched with shapes so precise they felt unnatural in a world of rough stone and rough men. I didn't know then that years later, Jacques de Molay would keep something that looked very much like it. Nikitas laid the metal plate on the table. Then he let a single drop of water fall on it. The droplet trembled. Rings spread outward, soft, concentric circles. But then something strange happened. Those ripples didn't spread randomly. They seemed to pause and gather at points that matched the engraved pattern, as if the geometry was guiding the movement. "Sound," Nikitas said, "can arrange matter. Geometry can arrange thought. Whoever holds both won't only build churches, they'll build a leaf." I felt cold at the back of my neck. He continued, quieter now, as if the walls might learn to listen. "Jerusalem is not only a prize people fight over. Beneath it are layers of time, Jewish, Roman, and older still. And there is something people have always searched for there, not because it is holy, but because it gives power." I asked, "What is it?" Nikitas looked straight into me. "Not a chest of gold, like the stories for children. A manual. Instructions. A way of understanding the world strong enough to make an empire wobble." I went silent for a long time. In a soldier's life, there are moments like that. No drums, no galloping horses, no battle cry. Just one sentence that makes you realize everything that comes after will be different from everything that came before. Then Nikitas offered me something like a proposal. "You want to protect pilgrims. Good, that is a righteous reason. But if you want to protect knowledge from the hands of those who turn it into chains, then you need an organization." I answered like a man who understood the world as it was. "An organization needs money, men, legitimacy." Nikitas nodded, not surprised at all. "Then use legitimacy to cover the purpose," he said. "Every age does." That night, I walked alone along the Sea of Marmara. The waves struck the shore softly, like whispers that didn't want to be overheard, and I kept asking myself what I was stepping into. Was it another crusade, or was it a labyrinth, one built from ideas rather than stone? Before I left Constantinople, Nikitas gave me a sentence, short enough to remember, sharp enough to cut. "A temple can fall, but the foundation, that's where people hide what matters." I carried that sentence with me to Jerusalem. And now, let me step out of my voice for a moment and speak to you from yours. From a modern perspective, Hugues de Payens was a real historical figure. He's widely considered the founder of what became the Knights Templar, formed around the year 1119 and officially recognized later at the Council of Troyes in 1129, under the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux. The Eastern keepers of memory you've just heard about are fictional, created from the atmosphere of Constantinople as it truly was, a crossroads of scholarship, theology, and older traditions moving beneath the surface of empire. There is no direct historical evidence that any secret group handed Hugues a mission tied to Atlantis or to any hidden manual of power. But the broader idea, Latin knights encountering Byzantine scholars, absorbing unfamiliar learning and brushing up against mystical currents of the time, is plausible in context. And sometimes, the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that can be proven line by line. They're the ones that explain why certain men started building organizations that could outlive them.
Jerusalem doesn't welcome anyone. It doesn't open its arms. It doesn't soften. It only endures, and it tests you. I arrived with 8 others, 9 knights in total. No army, no banners filling the horizon. Just a handful of men carrying a promise that sounded bigger than we were. Outside the city gate, pilgrims moved in long lines. Some sang hymns under their breath. Some walked in silence. Some looked like they were afraid they might change their minds if they stopped for even a second. And yes, the roads were dangerous, exactly as we claimed in our official reason for being there, but not because of demons, the way priests like to explain it. The danger came from greed, fear, and confusion, things human beings create and then blame on the dark. Not long after we arrived, I met Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem. He received us in a room that smelled of hot stone and armor, metal warmed by the sun, sweat trapped beneath leather. He looked at us the way a man looks at a cheap solution to an expensive problem. "What do you want?" he asked. I said, "Give us a place to live and the authority to protect the pilgrims." He narrowed his eyes. 9 knights? We don't promise results, we promise presence. I said it like a plea, but inside, I knew I was asking for something else, something I couldn't put in courtly language. And Baldwin, whether out of goodwill, politics, or simply because it was easier to control us if we were cornered, gave us quarters beside Al-Aqsa, a place the Franks called the Temple of Solomon. Later generations would say we dug for treasure. People love stories about chests filled with gold. The truth is less glittering and far more dangerous. We dug because Jerusalem is layered like sediment. Here, every truth is buried beneath other truths and beneath stories that have been repeated so many times they start to sound like law. By day, some of my brothers escorted travelers, guarded stretches of road, stood between the helpless and the hungry. But by night, we worked beneath stone. Not like treasure hunters, not like thieves, like men searching for a door that had been forgotten on purpose. We quickly discovered what modern archaeology would later confirm in its own way. Beneath that area were old cisterns, water reservoirs, along with narrow channels and underground spaces, a complex network under the Temple Mount and the surrounding ground. Jerusalem above was a city of prayers and blades. Jerusalem below was a city of echoes. But what kept me awake wasn't the engineering. It was the feeling that someone had calculated this place. One night, when our torches were guttering low, we found a stone slab marked with a carved sign, something like an 8-petaled flower or a star folded in on itself. It wasn't Hebrew, it wasn't quite Greek. It looked like a symbol meant for people who spoke in geometry. And I remembered Nikitas. He'd told me, the temple can fall, but the foundation, that's where people hide what matters. I pried the slab loose. There was no miracle, no holy light pouring out, no choir in the air, only a breath of cold, air that smelled of ancient earth, the way an old locked book smells when you finally open it. Beneath the stone was a small recess, just large enough for a man to crouch and reach inside. There was no gold. There was paper, bundles of parchment wrapped in linen, writing in more than one language, Latin, Greek, and a Semitic script I couldn't read, and among them a thin metal plate etched with precise geometric patterns, the kind of shapes Nikitas once showed me in Constantinople. In that moment, I didn't know whether I'd touched a relic or a set of instructions, but I understood immediately that if this fell into the hands of someone who wanted to tighten their grip on the world, it could become a new kind of law, more beautiful, more sophisticated, and more dangerous. One of the brothers asked, his voice unsteady, "What did we find?" I answered slowly, choosing the words like a man walking through a field of hidden blades. "We found a way to ask questions." That night, I didn't sleep. I read what I could, and what I couldn't read, I studied anyway, staring at the geometry the way you stare at a stranger's face when you're certain you've seen it before, in a dream you can't fully remember. Between the pages was a passage in clean Latin, copied by someone educated, someone careful. "Do not mistake faith for fear. Do not mistake the temple for the Creator. Do not mistake salvation for ownership." My heart hit hard in my chest. Those were sentences no one dared speak openly in Europe, not because they were false, but because they threatened monopoly. They threatened the idea that the sacred must always come with a gatekeeper. And gradually a shape formed in my mind. This was not only about guarding pilgrims, it was about guarding an idea, that a human being might reach for the divine without a machine standing in the middle, without an institution turning awe into control. But at the same time, another truth settled over me like cold dust. If we stepped wrong, we wouldn't be defeated by enemies outside the walls. We would be crushed by the men who claimed to represent order. So I began to think in terms of survival, not just physical survival, but the survival of what we'd stumbled into. We needed a public identity that sounded humble and harmless. We needed discipline tight enough to keep mouths closed and hands steady, like a monastery that happened to wear armor. And we needed a network, because if knowledge is a flame, you don't keep it in one torch where a single hand can snuff it out. You break it into embers, spread out, so that even if one dies, another still breathes. I wrote back toward Champagne. I didn't say what we found, not directly. I used coded language: stone, water, foundation, sound. The right reader would understand. The wrong reader would see only pious nonsense. And in Jerusalem, we kept digging. Not to take, to understand where to stop. Some nights, deep underground, wind slipped through cracks in the rock and sounded like distant singing. And I thought again of Atlantis. I stopped believing Atlantis was simply an island. I started believing it was a test, whether humanity was mature enough to hold knowledge without turning it into chains. If Atlantis ever existed in any meaningful sense, perhaps it didn't sink beneath water. Perhaps it sank beneath ambition. And I, a knight in a city where faith and hunger mixed like dust in the air, stood in the middle of it all and wondered, am I building a bridge or digging a deeper hole? At dawn, church bells rang. Pilgrims formed their lines again. I put on my cloak and stepped back into my role at the gates, doing what we claimed to do. But from that moment on, I knew we were no longer ordinary soldiers. We had become guards of something invisible, and invisible things have always made visible power tremble. Now, modern perspective, a correction and an analysis. The legend that the Templars dug beneath the
I learned a truth very early in Jerusalem. If you want to survive, you need a mask your era is willing to accept. The 9 of us could guard a road for a band of pilgrims. We could hold a corner of a gate on a bad night. But if we wanted to protect something invisible, scraps of parchment, geometric symbols, sentences strong enough to shake authority, then courage wasn't enough. We needed legitimacy. And in Europe at that time, legitimacy came with only one seal: the church. So I began writing back to the West, letter after letter, carefully, like dropping small stones into a deep well and waiting to hear an echo. I didn't dare describe what we had touched beneath the stone floors. I didn't dare name the thoughts that could be branded heresy. I wrote about roads, about pilgrims robbed and murdered on the way to the holy city, about the duty of a knight when ordinary people are walking through fear. Everything I wrote was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. And then there was one man who read more than the ink on the page: Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard wasn't a knight, he was a monk, yet one of the sharpest minds of the age. His voice could make proud lords lower their eyes. His words could turn an idea into a moral law that spread across Europe like fire catching dry grass. The first time I met Bernard, I felt something uncomfortable. The sense that he was looking straight through the part of me I was trying to hide, like a man spotting a dark stain beneath fresh paint. "Hughes," he said, "you want to build an order of knights who live like monks." I answered carefully, weighing every word. "Father Bernard, we want an order of knights who fear God and who have mercy for people." He held his silence, and in his eyes I saw the question he didn't ask out loud. Who are you protecting, and who are you protecting them from? Bernard didn't press me, but he offered something that told me he was a strategist more than a sentimental man. "I will help you, but in return, your order must have a rule, a clear rule, strict discipline, and most importantly, it must be placed under the church, at least in name." I understood the trap, and I understood the escape route hidden inside it. Under the church in name meant the church could claim it had created us, but in practice, we would have our own air to breathe, so long as we kept the trust of the public, and so long as we didn't challenge Rome too directly. That was the bargain, and bargains like that are how institutions are born. After Troyes, everything moved fast, like a storm with discipline. Men began sending their sons to us. They sent land, they sent livestock, tools, deeds, coin. Some gave out of faith. Some gave because they were afraid of being seen as lukewarm. But whatever the reason, it led to the same result. We had resources. And here is the paradox people rarely understand. Every Templar knight still swore poverty. Personally, he owned nothing, but the order itself was not poor. The order became a large body, where each cell possessed nothing, while the whole body possessed nearly everything it needed to function, to expand, and to endure. I traveled through France, through England, through Italy. Everywhere, a new kind of footprint appeared, a commandery, an order house. Sometimes it looked like a monastery, sometimes like a small fortress, sometimes like a farm with granaries and workshops, half prayer and half logistics, a place where discipline lived in stone and routine worked like a machine. And then an idea formed, not because an angel whispered it to me, but because reality demanded it. Pilgrims wanted to reach Jerusalem, and the journey was long. They carried silver and gold because they had no other way. The roads were dangerous. If they lost their money, they couldn't return home. If they were robbed, they might disappear without anyone even learning their names. So we built a solution. A pilgrim could come to a Templar house in Paris and deposit coin. In return, he received a written certificate, a promise backed by our network. He could travel light. Then, in a port city, Marseille, Genoa, or farther still in Acre, he could exchange that paper for funds. We charged a small fee,
just enough to maintain the roads between our houses, just enough to keep the system alive, and, inevitably, just enough to make other men start wanting it for themselves. I never called it a bank, I called it a commitment, but history would eventually use the word that fits: credit. Cross-regional finance, a system that allowed value to move without the weight of metal in your saddlebag. And once you control the movement of money, you begin to touch the breathing of war and peace, even without wearing a crown. I remember one evening in London, in a house that later generations would associate with us so strongly they'd call the church itself the Temple Church. A nobleman placed a key in my palm, his storage key, like he was handing off a burden he'd carried too long. "I leave it here," he said, "because I trust you don't belong to some passing king." And I answered, "We belong to an oath." He smiled, thinking I was speaking like a preacher, but I knew the deeper truth hiding inside his compliment. If we did not belong to a king, then sooner or later a king would ask the most dangerous question of all: then who do you belong to? In those years, I grew older. The curious young knight who had walked through Constantinople became a man who had to decide what to keep, what to abandon, what to say out loud, and what to bury in silence. The parchments from Jerusalem, we copied them. Not once, but many times. Yet no copy was complete, not because we wanted to be theatrical or mysterious, but because it was the only way to reduce risk. Knowledge kept whole can be taken whole. Knowledge scattered into pieces can survive. So we made fragments, carefully separated, stored in different places, entrusted to different hands. Not all hands, of course. Only those trained to understand that the greatest danger was not being attacked from outside, but being exposed from within. From time to time, I still took out the thin metal plate, etched with those precise geometric lines. I never dared to proclaim it some ancient secret. I wasn't a dreamer like that, not anymore. But it reminded me of something I didn't want to forget. The world runs on rules deeper than slogans, and power often survives by turning complexity into simple commands. Once, a monk asked me a question that sounded innocent but carried a knife inside it. He said, "Whose? Do you believe God is inside the church or outside it?" I didn't answer directly. I asked him something else. "Do you believe the sun only shines when someone opens a window?" He stared at me for a long moment, as if he wanted to argue but couldn't find a safe place to begin. Then he turned away without speaking, and I knew that from that day forward, a distance had formed between us and those who wanted a monopoly on defining faith. We began building too, not only buildings for storage and defense, but buildings that spoke, quietly, without declaring anything outright. Arches, vaults, octagonal spaces, stone arranged in proportions that felt balanced, almost musical. People said it was architecture, and yes, it was, but it was also language. A silent language telling those who knew how to look, the world is not only battlefields and church courts. The world also holds an order of geometry, of sound, of light, an order that exists without asking permission. And still, every empire has a crack. Years passed, then the news arrived like a violent wind. In the year 1187, Jerusalem fell to Saladin. By then, I was no longer young enough to ride day and night chasing a battlefield the way boys chase glory. But that night, I stood alone and watched the candle burn down to almost nothing, and I returned to the first question I'd ever carried like a stone in my chest. If God is truth, why does truth need so many guards? By then, I had an answer, more bitter than I wanted. Because human beings don't only fight over land, they fight over the story. Whoever controls the story steers the world. The Templars began as guards for roads. We became, slowly, one of the forces that reshaped how Europe worked, how wealth moved, how discipline was organized, how networks crossed borders, how stone itself could carry meaning. And when you change how the world operates, the world starts looking at you the way it looks at anything that cannot be left free for too long. Now, let me step out of my voice and speak to you in a modern one, briefly, clearly. The historical record supports much of this. The Templars did play a real role in safer transport and in managing assets across distance. Their written receipts and network of houses helped create early forms of credit and financial infrastructure in medieval Europe. Their power did not need mythical treasure. It came from something more practical. A disciplined organization spread across nations, protected by legal privileges, often answering directly to the Pope rather than to local kings. And the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was a turning point. It challenged the order's military purpose in the public imagination. Yet, the European network kept growing. That imbalance, less holy victory, more wealth and influence, planted seeds of suspicion and envy that would deepen over time. Because in the end, the dangerous thing was never a chest of gold, it was a system. And systems, especially the ones that move money, loyalty, and belief, always attract the attention of rulers who fear anything they cannot fully command. Philip IV of France didn't conquer with stories. He conquered with silence, with paperwork, and with a mind that measured the world in ledgers instead of legends. When Philip took the throne in the late 1300s, France was already a powerhouse, but it was also a kingdom under strain. Wars were expensive. Administration was expensive. Even the image of authority, castles, courts, diplomats, mounted patrols, came with a price that never stopped rising. And once a king discovers the true cost of ruling, he begins looking for new sources of money the way a desperate man looks for air. At first, Philip did what rulers had always done. He taxed, he tightened controls, he squeezed where he could. But there's a limit to how much pressure ordinary people can take before the kingdom starts to creak. And Philip was not the kind of man who would allow creaking. So he looked higher, toward other centers of power. In medieval Europe, there were only a few institutions strong enough to stand beside a crown. The nobility, of course, the church, certainly, and then there were the organizations that sat in an even stranger place, half spiritual, half military, and in the case of the Templars, deeply financial. The Knights Templar had become more than an order of warrior monks. They were a network. They ran fortified houses across Europe and the Mediterranean. They moved money safely across borders. They held deposits for nobles. They managed records. They could finance a journey, supply an army, and secure a transaction in a world where roads were dangerous and trust was fragile. And eventually, they were wealthy enough that even kings borrowed from them. If you've ever owed money to someone you can't control, you understand the discomfort Philip would have felt, not because a loan is shameful, but because it creates dependency, and dependency is the one thing a ruler cannot tolerate for long. The Templars were also independent in a way that made monarchs nervous. They weren't fully under the authority of local lords. They answered directly to the Pope. That meant they could operate across borders with privileges and protections other groups didn't have. In the modern world, we call it an international institution with special status, exactly the kind of thing a centralizing state would eventually try to bring to heel. Philip didn't rush. He never rushed. He understood something that still works today. If you want to destroy a powerful organization, don't begin with force. Begin with framing. Decide how you want the public to see your target, and then build the story that makes your actions feel necessary. But before Philip could safely move against the Templars, he needed to deal with the one shield they still held, the authority of Rome.
Because as long as the Pope stood firmly behind the Templars, any attack on them risked becoming an attack on the Church itself, and Philip was smart enough to know that even a strong king doesn't win a war against belief, not directly. So he fought the Church the way he fought everything else, through pressure, legal leverage, and politics. In the early 1400s, Philip collided head-on with Pope Boniface VIII, a man who believed the Church's authority should stand above kings. The tension wasn't just theological, it was financial and political. Who controls taxation? Who controls appointments? Who has the final word when crown and altar disagree? Philip refused to accept limits on his power, and he had people around him who understood how to weaponize law. One of the most significant was Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's legal mind and political enforcer. Nogaret wasn't a battlefield commander. He was something far more dangerous in a bureaucratic age, a man who could turn accusation into procedure, and procedure into legitimacy. The conflict with Boniface reached a breaking point. The Pope was humiliated and soon died, and in the vacuum that followed, Philip's influence expanded. When the next Pope was chosen, Philip made sure the seat went to someone far closer to French interests, Bertrand de Got, who became Pope Clement V. Clement wasn't a simple villain, and he wasn't a helpless puppet either, but he inherited a reality that would shape everything that followed. The papacy was drifting toward France, both politically and geographically. Clement's court would eventually settle in Avignon, within the French sphere of control. That alone changed the balance of power in Europe. Now, Clement had to navigate a situation where the spiritual leader of Christendom was standing on ground that could be shaken by the very king he needed to negotiate with. And that's where the Templars became more than a financial problem. They became a political bargaining chip. Imagine being Clement for a moment. The Templars answer to you on paper. Their privileges and protections flow through papal authority. But a king as powerful as Philip can strangle your influence without ever touching your crown. He can cut off money. He can cut off safe travel. He can isolate your allies. And he can shape the story of what's necessary for order. Clement's authority was real, but it wasn't absolute. Philip understood this perfectly, and once he had a pope he could pressure, the door to the Templars began to open. Now, in the Templar world, the man standing at the center of this storm was Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master. Jacques wasn't naive. He was a disciplined leader who saw the world change, saw the Holy Land slip away, and saw Europe's politics harden. But Jacques believed in procedure. He believed that if rumors grew, the church would investigate. He believed that evidence mattered and that a verdict would follow rules. That belief was honorable. It was also dangerous because Philip wasn't playing a game of evidence. He was playing a game of outcomes. Philip's genius, if we can call it that, was understanding that you don't need to prove a claim in a medieval kingdom the way you'd prove it today. You only need enough suspicion to justify action, and enough authority to make action feel righteous. That's why Philip didn't begin with soldiers. He began with whispers. In taverns and marketplaces, rumors spread. Quietly at first, then louder, then dressed in moral outrage, secret rituals, hidden oaths, strange ceremonies. In a world where most people lived openly and visibly under the church's gaze, secrecy itself sounded like guilt. And the Templars did keep secrets, mostly administrative, mostly procedural, mostly the kind of privacy any serious institution needs to function. But to someone like Philip, secrecy was useful, because secrecy can be turned into fear. Then came the paperwork, lists, dossiers, allegations shaped into formal language. That is how a political strike becomes an official mission. At the same time, Philip continued to tighten his state machine. He improved administration. He increased enforcement. He developed methods of coordination that allowed orders to travel fast and land everywhere at once. In a medieval world, that kind of coordination felt almost supernatural, not because it was magic, but because most rulers simply didn't have the infrastructure to do it. Philip did. And because he did, he could plan something that would stun Europe.
a synchronized, nationwide action against a powerful order, carried out so quickly that the targets couldn't organize a defense. As this machinery gathered momentum, Clement watched from Avignon, trying to keep control of a situation that was slipping away. He could draft letters, he could demand authority, he could insist on church jurisdiction, but every step had to be measured against the reality that he was now standing within France's shadow. And in Paris, the temple fortress still stood, solid and confident in stone, yet increasingly vulnerable in politics. Inside that fortress were ledgers and seals, records of wealth and trust, proof of a system that became bigger than any single region. Philip didn't just want money, he wanted control of what the Templars represented, a network that didn't belong entirely to the crown. That's the modern lesson hidden inside this medieval story. When a government is in debt, when it needs to centralize power, and when an independent organization holds resources and influence outside state control, the conflict becomes almost inevitable. The state will either absorb that organization or destroy it. Philip was preparing to do both at once, and the final step, the one that turns planning into catastrophe, was not a sword raised in anger, it was a seal pressed into wax. Jacques de Molay did not return to France dreaming of glory. He returned because the world around the order was changing shape, and he could feel the pressure building, like weather before a storm. By the early 1400s, the Holy Land was no longer the stable foothold it had once been. The old crusading dream was fading, and Europe's attention was shifting back to its own power struggles. Jacques understood that shift. He had lived through the collapse of strongholds in the East. He knew what it meant when alliances grew quiet, and the people who once praised you began asking, "What use are you now?" So Jacques came back to Europe to protect the order where it had become strongest, in its network, its property, its trust, and its influence. He arrived in France with the bearing of a disciplined soldier, measured, controlled, not theatrical. The temple in Paris was a fortress and a financial heart, and Jacques walked its corridors like a man inspecting the ribs of his own body. He listened to reports, he read ledgers, he spoke to his senior brothers in low voices over maps and accounts. He was trying to keep the order steady in a world that had begun to tilt. And then a reasonable idea began circulating through the halls of power. People said the military orders should merge. The Templars, the Hospitallers, combine forces, combine wealth, combine logistics, present a single unified sword for Christendom. On the surface, it sounded practical, almost inevitable, but Jacques resisted it immediately. Not because he hated the Hospitallers, not because he feared collaboration. He resisted because he understood what a merger really means in politics. It doesn't just unite strength, it also makes that strength easier to control or easier to break. A large, independent order with its own identity is hard to manipulate. A newly merged structure full of competing rules and rival hierarchies is far more vulnerable. Jacques knew that if the order's internal discipline cracked, everything else could be seized: its money, its records, its standing, even its story. So Jacques went to Pope Clement V. Clement was the one authority the Templars answered to directly, and Jacques believed the Pope could bring stability. But the papacy itself was under pressure, increasingly tied to French influence. Clement was a spiritual leader with political limitations, limitations that mattered in a way they hadn't for earlier popes. In Clement's presence, Jacques behaved as he always had, respectful, formal, direct. He listened to the talk of reforms and alliances. He listened to the talk of merging the orders, and he refused, politely, firmly, without drama. You can almost imagine the silence after his answer, because in that silence, two things became clear at once. Jacques would not surrender the order's independence easily, and the people around him were already considering what it would take to make him surrender it anyway. Jacques left the papal court with a sense of unease that grew heavier with every mile he traveled back toward Paris. He knew rumors were spreading, old whispers about secret rituals, strange initiation practices, coded oaths. He also knew secrecy was part of any disciplined brotherhood. The problem wasn't the secrecy. The problem was how easily secrecy can be turned into suspicion. Jacques tried to move carefully. He tried to keep everything within proper procedure. If there were accusations, let them be examined by the church. If there were questions, let them be asked openly. If there were doubts, let them be addressed by the only authority the order recognized as superior, the Pope. Then he met King Philip IV. The meeting itself was almost too polite. Philip greeted Jacques as if welcoming a respected servant of the faith. He praised the order's service. He spoke like a ruler concerned with unity and public confidence. And then he mentioned the rumors, casually, almost gently, like a man brushing dust from a sleeve. He said, "The people fear what they do not understand." Jacques answered in the most reasonable way possible. "If there are concerns, let the Pope investigate. We have nothing to hide from truth." In a just world, that would have been the end of the matter. But Philip was not searching for truth. Philip was searching for an opening. Jacques didn't see it immediately, because he was thinking like a man of vows and rules. Philip was thinking like a ruler who needed to turn a debt into a solution. When Jacques asked for a papal inquiry, Philip heard something else: permission to step forward under the cover of legitimacy, not because Philip would follow the Pope's process faithfully, but because he could use the language of process to justify what he had already decided to do. That is the trap at the heart of this chapter. Jacques believed procedure would protect the order. Philip understood procedure could be used as a weapon. After the meeting, Jacques returned to the temple in Paris and began doing what a responsible commander does when the air smells wrong. He tightened discipline. He ordered clear financial records. He sent instructions to local commanders to remain calm, to keep their houses orderly, and to prepare for scrutiny. He was preparing for an investigation. Philip was preparing for a strike. In the streets, the rumors grew sharper. In taverns, the story of the Templars shifted from holy warriors to strange men with secrets. In markets, people leaned closer and spoke of blasphemies they could not define. In churches, priests preached about purity, and listeners wondered who among them might not be pure. None of that required evidence. It only required repetition. Jacques sensed the danger of public opinion turning, because the Templars were not just protected by swords, they were protected by reputation. Their entire financial network ran on trust. If trust could be damaged, then their independence could be dismantled without a battle. So Jacques moved faster, quietly. Inside the temple, scribes tied bundles of documents. Couriers took sealed letters down torchlit corridors. In distant commanderies, commanders broke wax seals and felt the weight of the message in their palms before they even read the words. Brothers checked straps, packed satchels, organized ledgers, locked vault doors. Not because they were fleeing, but because they understood that when an institution is threatened, the first thing that must be protected is memory. Records, agreements, proofs of conduct, proof of service. A medieval institution lived or died by its paperwork. Meanwhile, in Philip's court, paperwork was being forged into a blade. Sealed orders,
accusations shaped into legal phrases, networks mapped, targets identified, messengers prepared. The machinery of a centralized kingdom turned quietly and efficiently, and that was Philip's advantage. The Templars were an international order, disciplined and widespread, but they were not a state. Philip was a state. He could coordinate faster, strike wider, and control the narrative from the first moment. Jacques still believed the Pope would intervene if anything went too far. He believed Clement would defend the order's legal status, but Clement was balancing on a narrow line: protect the Templars too strongly and risk open conflict with the French crown, or yield too much and weaken the Church's authority in the eyes of Europe. Clement hesitated. Philip advanced. That is how history mostly moves, not in one dramatic blow, but in a series of quiet steps that become impossible to undo. And then the air in Paris changed. It's the kind of change you can feel in a fortress before you see it in the street. Torches lingering longer in the mist, patrols moving with unusual discipline, the city itself seeming to hold its breath. Jacques stood at a narrow window inside the temple and saw it, faint lights in the fog, far off at first, then closer, like a river of fire flowing toward stone walls. Not a riot, not a mob, a formation. Organized power does not shout, it arrives. Jacques did not panic, he did not run. He did what a grand master does when he knows the world is about to test the meaning of his vows. He set his shoulders, he gathered his brothers, he prepared to face the law, because he still believed the law would recognize the truth. Outside, the officer at the head of the approaching line carried a sealed order. Behind him came men with spears, boots striking wet stone in one steady rhythm.
On the night before everything broke, France looked ordinary. Candles burned behind shutters, streets glistened with damp stone. People slept believing tomorrow would be another day of taxes, prayers, and routine. But in the royal chancery, nothing was routine. In a candlelit room heavy with smoke, scribes folded letters, pressed wax, and stamped them with the fleur-de-lis. Not one or two, dozens, each order sealed with the same quiet promise: open at dawn and act immediately. The genius of the plan wasn't cruelty, it was synchronization. The kingdom would move as one body, and the target would have no time to breathe. Before first light, messengers rode out through fog. Hooves struck wet cobblestones and splashed through puddles. Cloaks snapped in the cold wind. They carried packets that weren't meant to be read early. They were meant to land everywhere at once. At town halls, at bailiffs' offices, at castles, at monasteries, anywhere the king's authority could reach. In a provincial office, an official held a sealed packet above a table and waited, watching the sky lighten through a small window. Candlelight trembled. Outside, church silhouettes floated in the mist. When the moment came, the wax was cracked, the parchment unfolded, and the message was no longer a rumor. Arrest the Knights Templar, seize their property, secure their records, do not delay. Across France, the same action began in the same hour. Soldiers assembled outside commanderies while fog still clung to fields and rooftops. Officers checked the seal one last time, then signaled. Lines tightened. Spear shafts rose. Boots found rhythm. The arrests were not chaotic, they were administrative, like a harvest, except what was being harvested was trust. In Paris, the torch line appeared long before it reached the temple. Through the early dawn mist, it looked like a moving scar of light, flowing between timber houses toward the fortress walls. The temple wasn't a simple monastery, it was stone, iron, and discipline. It had seen threats before, but this wasn't an attack from outside Christendom. This was authority wearing familiar symbols. Inside the temple, candles shivered as if the building could feel what was coming. Brothers moved quietly in corridors, leather pouches tied shut, ledgers stacked, documents bound with cord. The order understood something most people never see until it's too late. When power arrives, it doesn't only take bodies, it takes narratives, it takes records, it takes the ability to argue back. Jacques de Molay rose in his chamber as dawn spilled through a narrow window. He didn't look like a man startled awake, he looked like a man who had been awake for weeks. In the courtyard, brothers gathered under arches, white mantles dim in fog, faces controlled but tight. No shouting, no confusion. Discipline was the last thing they still owned. Then the pounding began. Measured, heavy. Not the fist of a drunk at a gate, but the knock of a kingdom. Dust trembled in the beams above the door. Iron straps vibrated. For a moment, there was only the sound of wood, metal, and decision. The gate swung inward and fog spilled into the courtyard. Torchlight flooded the stone. Royal soldiers stepped through in formation, fleur-de-lis banners behind them, boots leaving wet prints. Spear tips glinted, not with menace, but with certainty. Jacques walked out to meet them. The officer unfurled the order and read it like a prayer. The words were formal, accusations of heresy and crimes against the faith, the kind of charges that didn't need to be proven in the eyes of a frightened public, only repeated until they felt true. Jacques listened without interrupting. His eyes didn't flinch. His jaw tightened slightly, then settled. When the order finished, soldiers stepped forward and took his arms. Firm grips, no unnecessary force. The mantle shifted under their hands. Rope was brought out, knots tightened. The wrist turn was natural, the tension real. Around him, brothers stood under guard, silent. One clenched a fist and let it go. Another stared at the ground as if memorizing the pattern of stone because it might be the last thing he saw as a free man. Then the search began. Royal soldiers moved through the temple's corridors with lanterns probing arches and doors. Chests were opened, shelves were stripped of ledgers. Keys turned in locks with the resistance of iron and time. Clerks sat at tables and began writing inventories, turning an act of seizure into something that looked official. And it worked, because paperwork is one of the oldest disguises for power. Outside, Jacques and other prisoners were marched into the misty Paris streets. The city watched in silence. People stepped aside. A child gripped a parent's sleeve. Faces were pale not only from cold, but from the shock of seeing something unthinkable become ordinary in the span of one morning. This wasn't just Paris. In commanderies across France, the same scene repeated. Soldiers at gates, orders read aloud, brothers bound, property sealed, records seized. The net didn't close gradually, it snapped shut. And once it shut, Philippe's second move began. Take control of the story. Accusations were read in squares and churches. Town criers spoke of secret rites and hidden blasphemies. Priests warned congregations about corruption wearing the mask of piety. People listened, and the rumor became a verdict in their minds long before any court convened. Some men confessed quickly. In the modern world, we'd ask how that could happen. In the medieval world, isolation and pressure could turn a person's will into a fog. And once a confession is written down, it becomes harder to fight than a sword because it lives in files and archives, ready to be read aloud as proof. Jacques was moved from chamber to corridor to cell. In the interrogation room, officials slid parchment toward him. A scribe sat ready with quill and sand. No need to show violence to understand what was happening. The room itself did the work. Stone walls, smoke, silence, the weight of authority watching you. When the cell door closed, it shut with the sound of finality. Keys turned with resistance. Iron clicked into place. And the man who commanded an international order now faced a new battlefield, one without banners, one without open honor, one that fought through paperwork and endurance. In Avignon, Pope Clement V received the news and reacted with anger. On paper, the Templars answered to him. On paper, a king had no right to seize them like criminals without papal authority. Pope Clement's hands tightened on the report. He contained his fury the way a man does when he knows he cannot afford to unleash it. Because Clement's power was real, but his situation was fragile. He had a throne of faith and a world of politics pressing in from every side. He could protest, he could demand jurisdiction, but he could not easily march an army into France and force Philippe to back down. Philippe, meanwhile, did what he had always done. He absorbed the moment. Reports came to his palace. Dossiers grew thicker. Seals pressed into wax. The machine continued without hesitation. Because Philippe understood that once a mass action begins, the key is momentum. If people can be convinced that everyone already agrees, then resistance becomes lonely, and loneliness breaks faster than any chain. And so by the time the fog lifted over Paris, the outcome was already taking shape. Not because the Templars had been defeated in battle, but because they had been redefined. Not guardians, suspects. Not protectors, threats. Not a sacred order, an excuse. That morning, France learned a lesson that still echoes in modern times. You can destroy an institution without ever drawing a sword if you can capture its narrative and seize its records. And as the last torches faded into daylight, the silence left behind was the loudest part of all. When the arrests swept across France, the world expected one thing: the Pope would stop it. On paper, the Knights Templar answered directly to Rome. They were not supposed to be the property of any king. Their privileges came from the church, and their vows were bound to papal authority. So when Philip's men seized them anyway, it wasn't only an arrest, it was a challenge to the spiritual hierarchy of Europe. In Avignon, Pope Clement V felt that challenge immediately. The papal palace was stone and ceremony, but the air inside it in the year 1308 was thick with political reality. Clement received reports, one after another, sealed packets, witness statements, inventories, confessions. The accusations were familiar in tone: secret rites, sacrilege, heresy. They weren't designed to be carefully examined. They were designed to stain. Clement could not ignore it. If the King of France could arrest a papal order at will, then the Pope's authority was no longer authority. It was suggestion. Clement had to respond, not only to protect the Templars, but to protect the idea that the Church still held ultimate jurisdiction. So he did what a pope could do. He ordered an inquiry. 3 cardinals were appointed to investigate and question the leaders of the Templars, including their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. It was a calculated move. Clement wanted the process pulled back under church control. He wanted the case handled as a matter of penitence and discipline, not as a royal purge. The investigation led the envoys north, through winter roads and muddy ruts, toward the fortress of Chinon. Chinon was not a grand cathedral city. It was a castle, stone walls on a hill above the Loire, cold mist rising from the river, a place where secrets could be kept simply because the world outside was too far away to listen. Even the approach to the gates felt like entering a verdict. Inside, torchlight colored everything in rust and shadow. Stone corridors echoed with footsteps. Iron keys swung on belts. Doors opened with the weight of old hinges and old decisions. And then Jacques de Molay was brought in. He did not walk like a man pleading for mercy. He walked like a soldier who had already accepted the possible ending and was simply determined to meet it standing. Chains moved with the inertia of his steps. Rope held his wrists. Torch smoke curled up the walls, but Jacques' posture stayed upright, his face controlled. The cardinals questioned him. They asked about rites, oaths, practices the public was calling blasphemous. Jacques answered in the narrow space between truth and survival. If he spoke too openly, he handed his enemies ammunition. If he refused entirely, he looked like a man hiding something. So he spoke carefully. He reminded them that discipline looks strange from the outside, that secrecy can be misread, that a brotherhood trained for war and administration does not conduct itself like a village parish. And beneath all that, Jacques held on to one core point. The order was not what the King of France was trying to paint it as. The scribes wrote, quills moved steadily across parchment, sand was sprinkled to dry ink, dossiers were turned page by page. The inquiry didn't feel like a battlefield, but it had the same weight, because the weapons here were words, and words can outlive men. After the questioning, the cardinals conferred privately. They weighed the accusations. They considered what could be resolved through confession and reconciliation. And then they produced the result that should have changed everything. They absolved the leaders. Clement, through his appointed investigators, allowed Jacques and the other leaders to reconcile with the church. In other words, in the eyes of official church procedure, they were not condemned as irredeemable heretics. This moment is one of the most haunting details in the entire Templar story, because it proves something important. The church did not fully endorse the narrative Philip was building. The truth was written down. It was sealed into record, and it still wasn't enough. Because the next lesson of this chapter is brutal. A document can be correct and still be powerless. Clement's inquiry created what we now call the Chinon record, what later historians would know as the Chinon parchment. It documented the church's position with more nuance than the popular story ever suggests. It shows Clement did not simply declare, "They are heretics, burn them." The situation was more complicated, more political, and far more tragic. Philip had no interest in nuance. In Paris, while Clement's envoys were writing careful conclusions, the king's machine was running at full speed. Rumors had already taken root. Confessions, some genuine, many deeply pressured, were being recorded as if they were final truth. Royal clerks were building a mountain of paperwork that would be impossible to climb over. Philip didn't need Clement's blessing to continue. He needed Clement's inability to stop him. And that was the Pope's crisis. Clement was trapped between two dangers. If he defended the Templars too strongly, he risked open conflict with France, a conflict he might not win, especially with the papacy operating within French influence. But if he abandoned the Templars, he weakened his own authority, and admitted, in effect, that a king could seize papal institutions when it suited him. So he did what a pope could do. He tried to hold the middle. He sought procedure. He sought investigation. He sought reconciliation. He issued letters. He insisted on church jurisdiction. And yet, each response came with caution, because he understood the political ground under his feet was not stable. Back in French courts, Philip's narrative hardened. Town criers read proclamations. Parishioners whispered. Officials held hearings that looked like moral purification, even as they served political ends. The story of the Templars became less about evidence and more about reputation. And in a society where reputation was a kind of currency, that mattered as much as any bank vault. In Chinon, the record of absolution was placed into storage, bundled, sealed, and locked away in chests as if it were a fragile thing. And in a way, it was. Not because it wasn't true, but because truth without power is fragile. Jacques returned to his cell. That's another brutal irony. Even after the inquiry, even after reconciliation, he remained imprisoned, because Philip had shifted the battlefield from the church's courtroom to the crown's agenda. Jacques had been pulled into a conflict where spiritual absolution did not equal political survival. In his cell, Jacques began writing small notes, fragments of memory, fragments of the order's perspective, not to argue in court, because he could see how little court mattered now,
but to preserve something that could outlive the moment, the correct story, or at least a counter-story, against the one Philip was cementing into the public mind. If there is any secret in the Templar story that doesn't require myths or hidden treasures, it's this: they understood the value of records. A king could seize gold, he could seize buildings, he could seize bodies, but if the order's knowledge, networks, and methods survived in fragments, letters, bundles, seals, maps, trained men, then something of the Templars would survive even after the name was destroyed. Clement, standing on a balcony in Avignon, may have understood that too. He could look out over the river and feel the weight of a decision he didn't want to make. He knew the truth was on paper. He also knew Philip was writing a different truth into the world through force and repetition. And Philip, in his map rooms, did what he always did: placed markers, tied cords across routes, and turned an international brotherhood into a problem with a solution. So Part 9 ends with a strange, quiet defeat. Not the defeat of an army, the defeat of a document. The Chinon record existed, the absolution was real, and yet the momentum of the crown rolled forward like a wagon that can't be stopped once it's been pushed downhill. In the torchlight of castles and candle smoke of palaces, Europe learned something it would learn again and again across centuries. Sometimes the truth is written down, and sometimes it still loses. In the end, the most powerful weapon used against the Templars wasn't a sword, it was a document. In the early spring of 1312, Europe gathered at the Council of Vienne. Stone halls echoed with the murmur of cardinals and bishops, and candle smoke drifted under vaulted ceilings as men debated not only a military order, but a question far larger than any one brotherhood. Can something exist in Christendom that is rich, disciplined, international, and not fully controllable by a king? Pope Clement V sat at the center of that storm. He had already seen the accusations. He had already seen the weaknesses in the evidence. He had already authorized an inquiry that, at least for the leadership, ended in reconciliation rather than a clean verdict of heresy. But Clement also understood something that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with survival. The papacy was operating under the shadow of France. The king was powerful, relentless, and deeply invested in one outcome, and Europe was watching to see whether the church could still hold authority over a crown. So Clement chose the path that kept the church standing, even if it meant sacrificing the order. He dissolved the Templar Knights, not with a dramatic condemnation that would admit the church had been wrong for generations, but through papal authority, framed as a necessary step to end scandal and conflict. In other words, the order ended on paper, not because every accusation was proven beyond doubt, but because politics demanded a clean ending. In a modern mind, this feels almost unbelievable. An organization can be erased without a decisive conviction simply because its existence becomes inconvenient. But in that era, law and power were intertwined. If the highest authority declares a structure dissolved, the structure becomes illegal overnight, no matter what its members believe. The decree left Vienne in sealed packets. Messengers carried it through muddy roads, under gray skies, into cities and rural commanderies alike. It arrived at gates that had once been sanctuaries. It arrived in halls where brothers had prayed, trained, and counted coin for pilgrims. And everywhere it arrived, the same moments repeated: the crack of a wax seal, the unrolling of a parchment, and the slow realization that a name could be taken away. In Paris, the temple fortress stood like a monument to what the order had become: stone walls, iron doors, records stacked high, chests locked behind guarded corridors. But after the dissolution, those same walls became a stage for something colder: inventory. Royal officials entered with scrolls, quills, and seals. They opened doors and counted assets. They measured, listed, and stamped. The act of taking was disguised as record-keeping, and record-keeping has a way of making theft look legitimate. On paper, much of the Templar property was meant to be transferred to the Hospitaliers. That was the official story, wealth redirected back into the church's military mission. But reality, as always, was messier. Property doesn't move by Latin alone. It moves through inspections, delays, temporary control, and fees that vanish into the hands of whoever holds the keys. And the man who held the keys in France was Philip. Philip didn't need a treasure chest from legend. He needed what the Templars actually possessed: cash flow, infrastructure, records of debts, and the ability to shift resources across borders. That was the real power, and power like that is never surrendered willingly by a centralized state. Still, something important happened in the shadows during these months, something history cannot prove in every detail, but cannot easily dismiss either. The Templars understood that if an institution can be dismantled, its memory can also be dismantled, so they moved quietly. In some places, brothers hid small bundles of documents in stone niches. In others, a pouch was slipped under a cloak and carried out by a man who no longer wore the Red Cross openly. And at the coast, in places like La Rochelle, legends persist of ships leaving harbor under cover of night, lanterns dimmed, sails catching wind, hulls slipping into fog. Maybe they carried chests of gold. Maybe they carried nothing but registers and seals. But if you understand how the Templars functioned, you know which is more valuable. Gold can be taken once. Records can build power for generations. That is why the image of a ship vanishing into darkness is so enduring, not because it proves a hidden treasure, but because it symbolizes something real. An organization that survived by distributing itself, by breaking its own body into pieces so no single blow could destroy everything at once. That's the part that feels almost modern. A network does not die the way an army dies. It dissolves, it adapts, it reappears under new names. In Portugal, where the crown had a different relationship with the Templars, the story took a new shape. The order was reorganized into what became known as the Order of Christ. Different emblem, different legal name, but many of the same men, structures, and methods continued. The discipline survived, even if the label changed. In parts of Spain, new orders formed to absorb property and personnel, reshaping what was left into something politically acceptable. And across Europe, former Templars did what humans always do when an institution collapses. They moved into other institutions. They became advisors, soldiers, administrators, craftsmen. They took their knowledge with them, because knowledge is the one thing you can carry without a wagon. Meanwhile, Jacques de Molay remained in prison. That fact alone tells you everything about the nature of the dissolution. The order was gone on paper, but the people who embodied it were still dangerous, not for what they owned, but for what they represented. Jacques was not only a man, he was a symbol. As long as he lived, the story was not fully settled. In his cell, Jacques wrote small notes, quiet fragments. He wasn't writing to inspire a rebellion. He was writing to preserve dignity, to keep the memory of the order from being defined entirely by its enemies. And in Avignon, Clement watched the consequences unfold. If he felt relief, it would have been brief, because even after the dissolution, the crisis remained. A king had shown he could bend the church to his will. Clement had chosen what he believed was the lesser catastrophe, but a lesser catastrophe is still a catastrophe. From a modern perspective, this is the turning point where the Templar story stops being a simple tale of betrayal and becomes a study in power. The Templars weren't erased because they lost a battle. They were erased because they had become a rival structure, financial, administrative, and international, inside a world where kings were learning how to centralize control. So when the paperwork left Vienne and spread across Europe, it didn't just end the military order. It sent a message to every other institution of influence. No matter how sacred your origins, if you grow strong enough to threaten the state will eventually come for you, using whatever language it needs, even the language of faith. And when the smoke cleared over the temple in Paris, the silence that remained was not empty. It was full of questions. Where did the records go? Where did the methods go? Where did the men go? And if an order can be killed on paper while its network survives in fragments, then maybe the real story of the Templars was never about treasure at all. Maybe it was about continuity. Maybe it was about how an idea can disappear from the surface of history and still move beneath it, like a river under stone. Paris, March of 1314. The Seine ran dark beneath a sky the color of iron, and the air carried that damp chill you only feel in cities built of stone and river mist. On the Ile de la Cité, crowds gathered not with joy, but with the uneasy curiosity that follows any public judgment. People arrived in wool cloaks and hoods, pressing close to ropes and guards, whispering behind cupped hands as torches hissed in the fog. A platform had been built near the riverbank. Timber beams, rope, iron nails driven in with steady blows. It wasn't built for spectacle, not officially. It was built for closure. Because in a case like this, the authorities didn't just want the Templars imprisoned, they wanted the story to end in public, where everyone could see it and no one could question it afterward. From the prison gate, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay were brought out on their guard. Chains hung with real weight from Jacques' wrists, rope pulled at his forearms as the escort guided him forward. Yet he walked upright, not rigid, not theatrical, simply steady, like a man determined not to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing fear. The march through Paris was quiet. No cheering, no riot, just the sound of boots on wet stone and the murmur of a crowd that didn't know whether to pity these men or fear them. The rumors had done their work. The proclamations had done their work. Even now, years after the first arrests, the air still felt poisoned with suspicion. When they reached the platform near the Seine, officials and clerics were waiting, parchments in hand, wax seals, formal robes, faces trained into calm authority. The intention was clear. Read the sentence, extract a final public confession, and lock the narrative into place one last time. Jacques stood before them as the clerk began to read. The parchment fluttered slightly in the river wind. The candle and torch smoke curled upward and disappeared into fog. The words were legal and religious at once, carefully shaped to sound like justice. The kind of language that doesn't ask the crowd to think, only to accept. Jacques listened without interruption. Then, when the moment came for him to confirm what he had once been forced to say, he did the one thing Philippe could not allow. He withdrew his confession. It wasn't dramatic, it was decisive. Jacques stepped forward, just one step, and raised his bound hands slightly, enough for the chains to tighten, enough for everyone to see the restraint and understand the cost of speaking. His voice, in the mind of the crowd, would have carried like a bell in the fog. He said, in essence, that the earlier confession had not been true, that fear and pressure had shaped his words, that the order had not betrayed the faith as the accusations claimed. That single reversal changed everything, because Philippe's case did not rest on evidence in the modern sense. It rested on momentum. It rested on public certainty, and public certainty can shatter if the central figure refuses to play his assigned role. A confession that is repeated becomes a foundation. A confession that is withdrawn becomes a crack. The crowd reacted in the way crowds always do when a story shifts unexpectedly. A ripple of murmurs, bodies leaning forward, then pulling back, faces tightened, eyes darted between officials and the prisoner. People who had come to witness a conclusion suddenly felt the uncomfortable sensation of uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous to power. A royal officer's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. He gave a small, decisive signal. Nothing theatrical, just a clipped movement of the hand, like cutting a thread. That signal meant the plan had changed. There would be no slow unraveling, no prolonged debate, no room for doubt to grow. Jacques and Geoffroy were moved away from the platform and toward the prepared woodpile. Torches were carried forward, resin smoke thickening as the wind off the river fed the flame. The authorities weren't interested in theater anymore. They were interested in ending the possibility of reversal. In moments like these, history often becomes myth. People later talk about curses, prophecies, divine justice. But even without myth, the sequence is chillingly clear. A man spoke truth too loudly for a king's narrative, and the system responded in the only way it knew, by silencing him. From the crowd, you would have seen smoke rising and twisting into the damp air. You would have heard water moving beneath the bridge, reflecting torchlight in trembling streaks. You would have watched silhouettes against firelight, one of them still standing with impossible stability. Whether or not Jacques spoke a final curse is something history records differently depending on the source. The legend says he called Philippe and Clement to answer before God within the year. The legend says he promised them judgment. And then, the year unfolded in a way that made the legend feel inevitable. In the spring, Pope Clement V died in Avignon. In the autumn, Philippe IV died in Paris. To a medieval mind, that could only mean divine consequence. To a modern mind, it looks like a harsh coincidence amplified by the sheer symbolism of timing. Clement was not a healthy man. Philippe carried the stress and strain of power in his body. Mortality doesn't require magic. But here's what matters regardless of whether you believe in curses or coincidence. Jacques de Molay's final act turned their deaths into a kind of sentence written by history itself. It made the end of the Templars feel more than just political violence. It made it feel like a warning, a reminder that power can win a moment and still lose the story. Clement's death in Avignon unfolded in hushed corridors of the papal palace, candles trembling, attendants moving quietly, prayers whispered. His body was carried in a solemn procession, clergy in dark robes, wax dripping from candles as smoke curled into an overcast sky. Philippe's end came not on a throne, but in the ordinary fragility of the human body. The king who had coordinated a nationwide purge, who had moved France like one machine, could not coordinate his own heart. His funeral filled a chapel with black drapery and fleur-de-lis banners dimmed beneath candlelight, as nobles and clergy stood still, breathing the same air of finality as everyone else. And in Paris, the temple fortress remained, stone walls and iron gates, yet emptied of its original meaning. The banners were gone. The brothers were gone. The silence inside those walls became its own kind of monument. Still, the story didn't end where Philippe wanted it to end. Because the Templars were not just buildings or men in white mantles. They were a method, a discipline, a way of organizing resources and trust across borders. And methods are hard to burn. Some former Templars were absorbed into new orders. In Portugal, the Order of Christ carried forward much of the infrastructure and expertise under a new emblem. Elsewhere, individuals disappeared into other institutions, into guilds, into courts, into commerce, taking skills and memories with them. In quiet monastery rooms, chests were closed and latched, bundles of parchment were stored, small leather pouches were tied shut, the kinds of things that are easy to overlook when you're hunting for gold, but priceless when you're trying to preserve a legacy. In the end, Jacques de Molay didn't leave Europe a treasure map. He left something far more inconvenient for tyrants: a question. If a king can destroy a respected order through accusation and bureaucracy, what else can be destroyed the same way? And if a story can be rewritten that easily, how do you protect the truth? Standing on that riverbank in 1314, Jacques de Molay may have lost his life, but he refused to let the narrative end in silence. He forced the world to see him not as a defeated criminal, but as a man who reclaimed his voice at the last possible moment. And because of that, the Templars didn't vanish cleanly into history. They sank into it, like smoke into fog, like a river under stone.
When people ask what the Knights Templar really left behind, most of them are hoping for something shiny. A hidden vault, a lost treasure, a relic that rewrites history. But if we strip away the romance for a moment and look at what actually survives in the world, the Templars' most valuable legacy is something far less cinematic and far more powerful. They left a method. In the early days, the Templars were a small brotherhood of disciplined men, living hard lives under simple rules. Yet, within a few generations, they built a network that stretched across Europe and into the Mediterranean world. Not because they discovered magic, but because they understood how to organize trust. They created commanderies, fortified houses and farms that functioned like way stations, storehouses, offices, and safe havens. They standardized routine. They kept records. They enforced discipline. They made their name mean something consistent whether you met them in Paris, on a muddy road in the countryside, or in a port near the sea. And then they did something quietly revolutionary for their time. They helped make long-distance travel safer by changing how money moved. Instead of forcing pilgrims to carry all their coins through dangerous roads, the Templars created a system of deposits and sealed notes. A traveler could leave funds at one house, receive a document, rolled, tied, sealed, and redeem it somewhere else in the network. It wasn't free money, it was trust, formalized into procedure. When you look at that through a modern lens, you see the outline of systems we still rely on: identity verification, secure transfer, standardized receipts, reputation-based credit. The Templars didn't invent modern banking in the way we know it today, but they helped shape a world where money could travel without the owner physically carrying it. And that's why their fall shook Europe so deeply. Because the Templars weren't just soldiers, they were part of the infrastructure of daily life, especially for nobles, merchants, pilgrims, and kings. They weren't the loudest power on the continent, but they were one of the most functional. They kept things moving. That, more than any myth, explains why powerful people feared them. And it also explains why after the order was dissolved, the legend refused to die. When something admired collapses too quickly, societies struggle to accept the plain version of events. They reach for a story large enough to fit the shock. A hidden escape, a lost treasure, a relic that rewrites history. But if we strip away the romance for a moment and look at what actually survives in the world, the Templars' most valuable legacy is something far less cinematic and far more powerful. They left a method. In the early days, the Templars were a small brotherhood of disciplined men, living hard lives under simple rules. Yet, within a few generations, they built a network that stretched across Europe and into the Mediterranean world. Not because they discovered magic, but because they understood how to organize trust. They created commanderies, fortified houses and farms that functioned like way stations, storehouses, offices, and safe havens. They standardized routine. They kept records. They enforced discipline. They made their name mean something consistent whether you met them in Paris, on a muddy road in the countryside, or in a port near the sea. And then they did something quietly revolutionary for their time. They helped make long-distance travel safer by changing how money moved. Instead of forcing pilgrims to carry all their coins through dangerous roads, the Templars created a system of deposits and sealed notes. A traveler could leave funds at one house, receive a document, rolled, tied, sealed, and redeem it somewhere else in the network. It wasn't free money, it was trust, formalized into procedure. When you look at that through a modern lens, you see the outline of systems we still rely on: identity verification, secure transfer, standardized receipts, reputation-based credit. The Templars didn't invent modern banking in the way we know it today, but they helped shape a world where money could travel without the owner physically carrying it. And that's why their fall shook Europe so deeply. Because the Templars weren't just soldiers, they were part of the infrastructure of daily life, especially for nobles, merchants, pilgrims, and kings. They weren't the loudest power on the continent, but they were one of the most functional. They kept things moving.
That, more than any myth, explains why powerful people feared them. And it also explains why after the order was dissolved, the legend refused to die. When something admired collapses too quickly, societies struggle to accept the plain version of events. They reach for a story large enough to fit the shock. A hidden escape, a lost treasure, a relic that rewrites history. But if we strip away the romance for a moment and look at what actually survives in the world, the Templars' most valuable legacy is something far less cinematic and far more powerful. They left a method. In the early days, the Templars were a small brotherhood of disciplined men, living hard lives under simple rules. Yet within a few generations, they built a network that stretched across Europe and into the Mediterranean world. Not because they discovered magic, but because they understood how to organize trust. They created commanderies, fortified houses and farms that functioned like way stations, storehouses, offices, and safe havens. They standardized routine. They kept records. They enforced discipline. They made their name mean something consistent whether you met them in Paris, on a muddy road in the countryside, or in a port near the sea. And then they did something quietly revolutionary for their time. They helped make long-distance travel safer by changing how money moved. Instead of forcing pilgrims to carry all their coins through dangerous roads, the Templars created a system of deposits and sealed notes. A traveler could leave funds at one house, receive a document, rolled, tied, sealed, and redeem it somewhere else in the network. It wasn't free money, it was trust, formalized into procedure. When you look at that through a modern lens, you see the outline of systems we still rely on: identity verification, secure transfer, standardized receipts, reputation-based credit. The Templars didn't invent modern banking in the way we know it today, but they helped shape a world where money could travel without the owner physically carrying it. And that's why their fall shook Europe so deeply. Because the Templars weren't just soldiers, they were part of the infrastructure of daily life, especially for nobles, merchants, pilgrims, and kings. They weren't the loudest power on the continent, but they were one of the most functional. They kept things moving. That, more than any myth, explains why powerful people feared them. And it also explains why after the order was dissolved, the legend refused to die. When something admired collapses too quickly, society struggle to accept the plain version of events. They reach for a story large enough to fit the shock. A hidden escape, a lost treasure, a relic that rewrites history. But if we strip away the romance for a moment and look at what actually survives in the world, the Templars' most valuable legacy is something far less cinematic and far more powerful. They left a method. In the early days, the Templars were a small brotherhood of disciplined men, living hard lives under simple rules. Yet, within a few generations, they built a network that stretched across Europe and into the Mediterranean world. Not because they discovered magic, but because they understood how to organize trust. They created commanderies, fortified houses and farms that functioned like way stations, storehouses, offices, and safe havens. They standardized routine. They kept records. They enforced discipline. They made their name mean something consistent whether you met them in Paris, on a muddy road in the countryside, or in a port near the sea. And then they did something quietly revolutionary for their time. They helped make long-distance travel safer by changing how money moved. Instead of forcing pilgrims to carry all their coins through dangerous roads, the Templars created a system of deposits and sealed notes. A traveler could leave funds at one house, receive a document, rolled, tied, sealed, and redeem it somewhere else in the network. It wasn't free money, it was trust, formalized into procedure. When you look at that through a modern lens, you see the outline of systems we still rely on: identity verification, secure transfer, standardized receipts, reputation-based credit. The Templars didn't invent modern banking in the way we know it today, but they helped shape a world where money could travel without the owner physically carrying it. And that's why their fall shook Europe so deeply. Because the Templars weren't just soldiers, they were part of the infrastructure of daily life, especially for nobles, merchants, pilgrims, and kings. They weren't the loudest power on the continent, but they were one of the most functional. They kept things moving. That, more than any myth, explains why powerful people feared them. And it also explains why after the order was dissolved, the legends refused to die. When something admired collapses too quickly, societies struggle to accept the plain version of events. They reach for a story large enough to fit the shock. A hidden escape, a lost treasure, a relic that rewrites history. But if we strip away the romance for a moment and look at what actually survives in the world, the Templars' most valuable legacy is something far less cinematic and far